How do saturation divers live under pressure for weeks? Your shift is over. You've spent hours working on the seafloor, surrounded by freezing water, heavy equipment, steel pipelines, darkness, and enough pressure to turn a normal diving mistake into a very serious problem. So naturally, you go home. Except your home is not on land. You don't climb onto the ship, take off your gear, breathe normal air, eat dinner, and go to bed. You climb into a sealed metal bell. The bell rises through hundreds of feet of ocean. It reaches the ship. And then, even though you're technically back at the surface, you still can't go outside. You can't open the door. You can't walk onto the deck. You can't breathe the same atmosphere as the people standing only a few meters away from you. For the next several days, sometimes weeks, you may live inside a pressurized steel chamber with a handful of other divers. You eat there, you sleep there, you shower there, you talk to your family from there. And every day, instead of commuting to work in a car, you climb into another sealed chamber and get lowered to the bottom of the ocean. The strangest part is that none of this is an unfortunate side effect of the job. It is the solution. Commercial saturation diving deliberately keeps divers under pressure for extended periods, because repeatedly returning them to normal atmospheric pressure after deep work would create an even bigger problem. NOAA describes saturation operations as keeping divers compressed for days or weeks, then transporting them to the work depth in a diving bell. IMCA describes modern commercial saturation work involving periods of up to about 28 days in a chamber and daily bell runs to the seabed. And once you understand why, the entire profession starts looking less like ordinary diving and more like running a tiny human habitat under conditions where almost everything about normal life has to be redesigned. Because saturation divers don't simply work underwater. For a while, in a very real physiological sense, they live there. The first thing to understand is that depth changes gases in ways your body cannot ignore. At sea level, we spend our entire lives under roughly 1 atmosphere of pressure and barely notice it. Go underwater and pressure rises quickly. And when you breathe gas under greater pressure, more inert gas can dissolve into the tissues of your body. That itself is not automatically catastrophic. The problem appears when the pressure around you decreases too quickly. The dissolved gas needs time to leave your tissues and be carried to your lungs. Reduce the surrounding pressure too fast, and bubbles can form in the body. That is decompression sickness, the condition divers famously call the bends. It can cause joint pain, neurological injury, and in severe cases can be life-threatening. This is why decompression is controlled rather than treated like an elevator ride back to the surface. For an ordinary dive, this can mean controlling ascent speed and, depending on the exposure, making decompression stops. But imagine performing deep commercial work day after day. Dive down, work, spend a long time decompressing, return to the surface, sleep, wake up, do it all again. At a certain point, this becomes spectacularly inefficient. Your body keeps absorbing inert gas during each deep exposure. Then you spend enormous amounts of time carefully getting rid of it. Saturation diving attacks the problem from a completely different direction. Instead of repeatedly decompressing the diver, stop decompressing them, at least temporarily. The diver is compressed to a pressure appropriate for the operation and remains in a pressurized living system between working dives. After sufficient exposure at a given pressure, the body's tissues approach saturation with the inert gas at that pressure. Staying longer doesn't keep creating an endlessly growing decompression obligation in the same way. So the operation can send divers repeatedly to work, while postponing the major decompression until the end of the saturation period. That is the basic logic, and it is wonderfully counterintuitive. The problem is that returning to normal pressure takes a long time. So the solution is to not return to normal pressure every day, which creates an obvious second problem. Where exactly do you put a group of humans who are technically on the surface but physiologically still living at depth? Inside something that looks like a cross between a submarine, a spacecraft, a hospital pressure chamber, and an extremely unpopular hotel. A saturation system normally includes pressurized chambers where the divers live and sleep. These chambers are installed on the support vessel or offshore installation. From the outside, the divers may be sitting only a few meters away from people breathing ordinary air. Inside, however, the atmosphere is maintained at elevated pressure. The steel boundary between those two environments is doing something extremely important. One side belongs to normal surface life. The other belongs to the pressure regime of the dive. And that makes the door one of the most consequential doors you will ever encounter. You cannot simply open it. If someone inside suddenly decides that they've had enough of their roommates and would like to go for a walk on deck, physics has an objection, a fairly strong one. So food, equipment, supplies, and other items have to move through specially designed locks that allow material to pass without destroying the chamber pressure. The divers remain sealed inside while the outside support team manages almost everything around them, which means saturation diving involves a strange inversion of normal offshore work. The divers may be the people doing the dramatic job on the seabed, but an enormous amount of their survival depends on technicians they may not even physically stand beside for weeks. Life support personnel monitor the chamber environment, pressure, and gas conditions. IMCA certification material specifically emphasizes the importance of monitoring gas content, depth, and pressure during saturation operations. And gas becomes far more complicated than simply pumping normal air into the chamber. At significant depth, breathing gases have to be carefully selected and controlled. Helium-oxygen mixtures are associated with saturation and deep mixed gas diving, and helium changes some things immediately, including the sound of the diver's voice. The U.S. Navy has even tested communication equipment designed to process the altered speech produced when divers breathe helium-containing mixed gas during saturation diving, which means one of the most technologically demanding occupations on Earth also comes with the possibility that everyone sounds temporarily like they have been hired to voice a cartoon character. The funny voice is harmlessly memorable. The reason behind the gas management is not. At depth, the partial pressures of the gases being breathed matter enormously. Gas mixtures must be managed according to the operating conditions, rather than treating ordinary surface air as universally appropriate. And once the atmosphere inside your home has become part of an engineered life support system, ordinary things stop being ordinary. Cooking changes, fire safety changes, cleaning changes, temperature management changes. Even deciding what equipment can be brought into the chamber becomes a technical question. You are no longer simply living in a room. You are living inside a controlled hyperbaric environment. And then morning comes, or at least the schedule says it does. There may be no sunrise inside the chamber, no commute across a parking lot. Instead, the divers prepare to enter a closed diving bell. The bell connects to the saturation system, while both remain compatible in pressure. Divers transfer into it without returning to normal atmosphere. The bell is sealed, disconnected, moved over the side of the vessel, and lowered through the water toward the worksite. This is sometimes called transfer under pressure. The commute can take a diver from a steel chamber on the ship to a worksite hundreds of feet below the surface without making the body repeatedly cross all the way between working pressure and normal atmospheric pressure. NOAA's description of saturation operations outlines exactly this general arrangement. Divers remain compressed in a surface chamber, then travel to depth in a bell. Now imagine the psychological transition. A few minutes ago, you were sitting inside what counts, by saturation diving standards, as your living room. Now you're descending in a sealed bell hanging beneath a ship into water that becomes darker as you go. The bell reaches working depth, and this is where the job finally begins. One or more divers leave the bell to work, while another diver may remain associated with the bell as part of the team and safety arrangement, depending on the operation. Outside, the diver is connected through an umbilical. That word makes it sound almost gentle. The actual device is closer to a lifeline containing several of the things that separate a working diver from a very bad day: breathing gas, communication, and, in many saturation operations, hot water used for thermal protection. Real incident reports make the dependence brutally clear. IMCA has documented cases in which a severed umbilical caused a diver to lose surface-supplied gas, hot water, and communication simultaneously. That hot water is not a luxury shower being routed inconveniently through the ocean. It is part of the thermal survival system. Deep water can be extremely cold, and a diver doing heavy work may spend hours exposed to it. So heated water can be circulated through specialized diving suits, which creates another strange feature of saturation work. You can be breathing a carefully engineered gas mixture, communicating through a hardwired system, working with industrial tools on the seafloor, while warm water is literally being pumped down from the surface to stop your body from losing too much heat. The diver looks independent. In reality, the diver is attached to an enormous invisible machine reaching all the way back to the vessel. Cut that connection, and suddenly, problems that were being quietly solved every second become visible. Breathing, heat, communication, location, power, backup. The ocean doesn't need to attack you. It only needs one of your support systems to stop doing its job. And this is why saturation diving is less about a heroic person defeating the sea, and more about layers of engineering refusing to let the sea have an opportunity. If you're enjoying this kind of breakdown, the hidden systems that let humans work where we were absolutely not designed to live, subscribe, and tell me in the comments which impossible workplace we should go inside next: a nuclear submarine, an Antarctic station, or an offshore oil rig. Now here's where saturation diving becomes even stranger. After 6 hours or so of work in some commercial operations, you don't necessarily feel the satisfying relief of going back to the surface. You return to the bell. The bell closes. It rises. Eventually, it reconnects with the saturation complex. You crawl back into the living chamber, and you're still under pressure. Your shift ended. Your dive ended. But physiologically, your trip to the surface did not. IMCA describes commercial saturation divers commuting daily to the seabed in a diving bell, while remaining confined to the chamber system for extended periods. So now, we need to discuss the part of saturation diving that dramatic underwater footage usually ignores: living with other humans, in a metal cylinder, for weeks. There is limited personal space. Beds are compact. Equipment is everywhere. Privacy is not exactly a defining feature of the Architecture. You eat near the same people. You work with the same people. You rest near the same people. You hear the same people moving around. Then you go to work with some of those same people in an environment where your safety depends on everyone doing their job correctly. This is one reason the psychological side of the profession matters. Boredom, fatigue, disrupted routines, interpersonal tension, and confinement aren't movie-style dangers, but they can affect people whose work depends heavily on discipline and attention. The system therefore creates routine where the natural environment has removed it. Work schedules, sleep schedules, meals, checks, communication, exercise where possible, maintenance, medical monitoring. The human brain likes structure. A saturation chamber has to manufacture some of that structure artificially. There is another problem hiding in the background. What if someone gets sick? Normally, if you are on a ship and develop a serious medical problem, the ideal answer is some version of, get the person to advanced medical care. For a saturation diver, you cannot pretend the pressure difference doesn't exist. A diver under saturation cannot simply be pulled through a hatch and placed in an ambulance without accounting for decompression. Medical planning, therefore, has to consider the hyperbaric environment itself. This is also why saturation systems require procedures for emergencies that would sound bizarre almost anywhere else. What if the ship develops a serious fire? What if the vessel has to be abandoned? Normal crew can go to lifeboats. The saturation divers may still be under elevated pressure. You cannot save them by suddenly exposing them to normal atmospheric conditions. So some systems include hyperbaric evacuation arrangements designed to move pressurized divers away from the vessel while maintaining the environment they require. IMCA maintains specific guidance covering hyperbaric evacuation systems and hyperbaric reception facilities because rescuing a pressurized person is fundamentally different from evacuating an ordinary passenger. Think about how strange that is. The ship can be in danger, everyone needs to leave, and one group may need to escape while still bringing their atmospheric pressure with them. It is probably one of the few evacuation scenarios where get outside immediately can itself become dangerous. And the diving bell has its own nightmare scenario. The bell is the connection between the chamber and the seabed. Normally, it receives critical support through systems connected to the surface. But what if it becomes trapped? What if lifting arrangements fail? What if important connections are lost? The industry has a term for one class of these events, a lost bell emergency. IMCA describes it as a rare but life-threatening situation in which a closed bell and its divers cannot be recovered, and surface supplies such as breathing gas or heating may be lost. This is why redundancy in saturation diving can look excessive until you remember what redundancy is buying. Backup breathing gas, emergency systems, recovery procedures, standby capability, monitoring, multiple barriers between a failure and a fatal outcome. The goal isn't to build something that can never fail. That's impossible. The goal is to prevent one failure from gaining permission to become 5 failures. And real incidents show exactly why. In a documented offshore accident, a vessel experienced a dynamic positioning problem and drifted away from the work site. One diver's umbilical became caught and was severed. In a single event, he lost breathing gas supplied through the umbilical, communications, and hot water. He switched to emergency bailout gas. The vessel had moved hundreds of meters from its original position before the situation was brought under control. He was eventually recovered and survived. There is an even more famous case involving saturation diver Chris Lemons. During a 2012 incident, a vessel positioning failure contributed to his umbilical being severed while he was on the seabed. IMCA's account says he lost the line that supplied air, light, and heat, and was stranded at roughly 300 feet, with only a limited emergency gas supply before rescue eventually reached him. The remarkable part of stories like this is often presented as individual survival, and obviously, individual survival is remarkable, but there is another lesson hiding underneath it. Saturation diving normally feels possible precisely because dozens of critical systems are working so consistently that you stop noticing them. The emergency reveals the YBO architecture. The moment the umbilical disappears, you suddenly see everything it had been quietly doing. That is true of almost every extreme human environment. We notice technology when it arrives. We understand infrastructure when it disappears. But even if nothing goes wrong, every saturation period eventually approaches the same final event: decompression. And this time, there is no clever way to postpone it. The divers have completed their working period. They are not going back down tomorrow. Now the body needs to return carefully towards surface pressure. The pressure inside the living chamber is reduced according to a controlled decompression schedule. Slowly. Very slowly compared with the elevator ride everyone wishes it could be. This can take days, depending on the exposure. And here is the strange part psychologically. You've finished the dangerous underwater work. The welding is done. The inspection is done. The pipeline work is done. You're already physically aboard the ship, but you are still not home. You can potentially be a few centimeters of steel away from normal atmospheric pressure and still have a long decompression process ahead of you. There may be people walking outside the chamber. Food can come from outside. Voices can come from outside. You may be able to communicate with family. But until decompression is complete, normal surface life remains physically inaccessible. This turns the basic emotional logic of diving upside down. For most divers, reaching the surface feels like the end. For saturation divers, reaching the deck can happen long before the body is ready to finish the journey. And that is the part that makes the name saturation diving so revealing. The defining achievement is not simply going deep. Humans had been finding ways to descend underwater long before modern saturation systems existed. The breakthrough was learning how to make prolonged exposure operationally manageable, how to build a temporary artificial world around the diver's physiology. A world with controlled pressure, controlled gases, controlled temperature, food passed through pressure locks, communication routed through systems, a steel bell acting as a commuter vehicle between two pressurized spaces, umbilicals carrying what the diver needs to stay alive and work, teams on the surface monitoring an environment they themselves are not living inside, emergency systems designed around the fact that even rescue has to respect pressure, and finally, a decompression process that slowly gives the divers back something the rest of us receive for free every second of our lives: ordinary atmosphere. So saturation divers are often described as people who live underwater. Technically, many of them spend their off hours in chambers located on a vessel at the surface. But physiologically, the description makes a strange kind of sense. For weeks, the ocean determines the pressure of their home. The seabed determines the gas strategy. The cold determines the heating system. The distance from the surface determines the rescue plan, and their bodies remain adapted to a world they cannot simply walk away from, which means the most impressive thing about saturation diving may not be that humans can work hundreds of feet below the ocean. Machines can go deeper. Robots can remain longer. The truly strange accomplishment is that we learned to bring fragile human biology into that environment, and then surround it with enough engineering that a person can finish a shift, eat dinner, complain about a coworker, climb into bed, wake up the next day, and go back to work at the bottom of the sea. A saturation diver doesn't conquer pressure. Pressure never stops being in charge. We simply learned how to negotiate with it. And the price of that negotiation is that sometimes, when your workday ends and you're already back on the ship, you still can't go home.